Hey, Cool Stuff's gonna have a booth at Gen Con, so if you have any Magic cards, Yu-Gi-Oh cards, or HeroClix singles to get rid of, please stop by. We offer great prices and a 25% bonus for trade-ins. Please visit our website for more information. Thanks for watching, and now it's time for Judge's Corner.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Judge's Corner. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about zones. So, zones are where things reside when they're in a game of Magic, like how creatures tend to hang out on the battlefield. But they can also be found in other places. For example, they could be lurking in players' hands, or summoned from the stack, found in exile or even dead in the grave, undiscovered in libraries or commanding armies. Or they could just be gambling at your local casino. So the next important thing to note about zones are that there are two zones in which players can't normally look at everything that's in them. The hand and the library are two zones that are considered hidden zones, where you don't get access to look at the cards that are in them unless you have the privilege to look at those cards or an ability that lets you look at them through like cracking a fetch land. The other 6 zones are public zones, and you can normally go look at all of the cards that are in them, with the exception of a couple of effects like a Praetor's Grasp that exiles something face down, or a morphed card that is currently face down. Those cards normally can't be looked at unless you control those cards, or an effect lets you look at them. So there are certain zones that we share, but there are 3 zones that we have individual zones for each player. Those are the hand, the library, and the graveyard. That's important to note for when things return things to those zones. When that happens, like an unsummon on a creature I control, it always returns to its owner's version of that zone, regardless of who controls it. And the next thing I want to talk about are how things can't leave certain zones. Like how a Vanguard or Plane can never leave the command zone, or how an instant or sorcery can never enter the battlefield. There are certain things that can go in certain zones and move all around, but there are certain things that can never leave or never enter specific zones. Next, let's take a look at each zone a little more closely. So the first zone we're going to take a look at is the library, which is basically the deck of cards that you start with in a single face-down pile. You can't look at those cards or change the order of them unless you have something that allows you to do that, and the number of cards remaining in a library can be counted by anyone. If cards are all put on the top or the bottom of your library at the exact same time, they can be put in any order that the player who controls those cards wishes. For example, a terminus on a bunch of creatures on the battlefield. And the order does not need to be revealed to your opponent. Also, if the top card of your library is being revealed and you play something that changes it, the new card won't be revealed until that thing that changed it is fully cast. So, for example, let's say we have a Future Sight on the battlefield, and we play an Ancestral Recall off the top of our library. We won't get to see what the next card is on top of our library until that Ancestral Recall is 100% cast and waiting to be responded to. Also, it's worth noting that whenever you draw a card with Ancestral Recall with a Future Sight on the battlefield, your opponent and every other player is going to be able to see each individual card that you draw. So the next zone is the hand. It's where cards you've drawn for the game wait to be cast, or where cards get bounced back to it. You start the game off by drawing 7 cards, and this is your hand. And you can have any number of cards in your hand at any time, but at the end of your turn, if you have more than 7 cards in your hand, during the cleanup step, you're going to have to discard down to 7. And finally, you can't look at your opponent's hand normally, but you can count how many cards are in it. So, the next zone is the battlefield, which is basically that big empty space between you and your opponent. It's where permanents go, and normally your stuff stays near you, but sometimes it can venture off into your opponent's territory, such as with auras or when you steal something. And whenever a permanent enters the battlefield, it becomes a new object and has no memory of its previous visit to the battlefield. The next zone is the graveyard, which is basically your discard pile, where dead or used up cards go. Everything goes to the top of the discard pile and is face up, and the order cannot normally be changed. If multiple things would go into the grave at the same time, like through an effect like Wrath of God, the result is the same as our Terminus example, where the player who controls all the cards going to the graveyard gets to decide the order in which they want to put them in. And players can examine their own or their opponent's graves at any time that they wish. The stack is the next zone I want to talk about, and this is where spells or abilities go, when we're waiting for them to resolve. Things like that sorcery you just played that's going to let you draw cards go on the stack, or triggered abilities that trigger when a creature enters play go on the stack. The stack is used to keep track of things that players have played and where they go when they're waiting to resolve. To learn more about the stack, watch one of our previous videos on the topic. So the exile is kind of like card purgatory. Sometimes things go there forever. Sometimes things go there for just a moment. And sometimes things escape. Unlike the deck, hand, and grave, Exiled cards don't have to remain in one pile, and are typically encouraged to be in corresponding piles based on their impact on the game or likeliness to return, such as things like Oblivion Ring, Path to Exile, or Aetherling. Some things are linked to things in exile, in the case of Isochron Scepter and its imprinted spell. And if for some reason something in exile would be exiled, it stays in the exile, but it becomes a new object in the exile. So if this were to happen on the imprinted card on Isochron Scepter, it would lose its imprint. The next zone I want to talk about is the command zone. This is a zone for extra stuff that has a wider impact on the game. Things like Vanguard cards, or Plane Chase cards, or emblems, all reside within the command zone. Also, generals for the format Commander also reside in the command zone, but they have a couple of special rules that only impact them. The last zone is a zone that players tend to forget about, the anti-zone. The anti-zone is where cards would go when you were following the old anti-rules for Magic the Gathering, when you were gambling them against another player. Wizards of the Coast doesn't really support this format or rule any longer, so the zone doesn't really get used much anymore. And to avoid confusing players, I really don't want to discuss the ante or the anti-zone too much. If you feel like learning more about ante, go ahead and read up on it in the comprehensive rules. The next thing I want to take a look at are how things can become a different object. Let's take a look at a closer example of this. So let's say that we have a Hellrider attacking, and our opponent decides that they want to destroy it in the declare blocker step with a Putrefy. When this happens, we really don't want our Hellrider to die, so we play a Restoration Angel and target our Hellrider to blink it. When this happens, our Hellrider is going to become a new object, because it just re-entered the battlefield. The previous object that Putrefy was targeting is no longer there, so it's going to be countered by game rules when it goes to resolve. The reason for this is because when cards leave play or change zones, they become a completely new object. So this is important to note because whenever anything changes zones, it becomes a new object. So we could talk about objects a little longer, like some of the rules that objects can break, but I want to save that for a whole nother episode. In the meantime, let's talk about wishes, namely Living Wish, Cunning Wish, Burning Wish, anything that can get cards from outside of the game. Cards that are outside of the game aren't in any zones. And for Sanctioned Magic, the only place you can go for cards outside of the game are cards in your sideboard. For casual play, your friend's hand from across the room, cards from your trade binder, I don't really care, as long as it's not in one of the 8 zones that you're currently playing with. So, with that, this concludes our episode, and if you have any questions, make sure to send us them at judgescorner@gatheringmagic.com. And until next time, remember to stay in the zone, unless it's the danger zone.